Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Lord Gord Podcast. This is your host, Lord Gord. I'm giving you information that's factually correct and politically incorrect. And I'm excited to be speaking to you guys whenever you're listening to this. And I have a very important topic that I'm discussing today. Today, I'm discussing social justice. And I'm going to discuss the insidiousness of social justice. I'm going to break it down with the tenets of the ideology, what purveyors of the ideology believe, and consequences of the ideology when it is practiced, not only in today's time, but historically as well. So let me just dive into this. Social justice is an ideology of discrimination, hatred, resentment, and centralized power. It is antithetical to human freedom, individual rights, meritocracy, and to justice itself. It is an attempt to right the wrongs of the world, an attempt to shape the world to the whims of a concentrated, self-anointed elite. This ideology, said to be in the name of compassion, leads to a centralized elite making decisions for individuals, a form of tyranny, if not outright tyranny itself, and it leads to wide-scale poverty, dysfunction, resentment, and death. Yes, death. Let me keep going here. The idea of social justice. The idea of social justice is that because some people are disadvantaged in some way and others are privileged in some way, a concentrated elite must use coercive power to right such wrongs. It is an idea that leads to lower standards for certain groups, discrimination against certain groups, dictating the law as one sees fit and not as it is written, racial resentment, and other adverse consequences. And the reality is that life chances and circumstances are different for different groups of people, not only due to discrimination. For example, I read a book about the Hmong people. And the Hmong people were very isolated culturally. I believe they lived pretty high up in the mountains. So they were never colonized, nor did they ever have to assimilate to the values of mainstream society because they were so isolated. So when they started moving to the United States in the 1980s into Merced, California, you had people who had never used toilets before. They didn't know how to use toilets. You had widespread poverty, welfare dependency, resentment. You had people who didn't want to go to the doctors because they felt like sacrificing chickens and goats would cure their medical ailments. And none of this backwardsness and none of this poverty is due to discrimination or racism or antagonism towards Hmongs as a people. Their poverty was due to their lack of human capital and to their ignorance. And it's not only true for Hmongs, but it's true for isolated people in general, whether they're isolated on islands away from mainstream society or they're isolated in mountains. You know, it is devastating to a culture when it cannot interact with other cultures and learn other ideas from other cultures. I mean, you had this with China and Japan as well. You know, they had periods where they lagged behind the world because they chose to isolate themselves and not avail themselves to the ideas and achievements of different societies. So you also have political factors. You know, say someone is from Cuba, for example, and they don't have access to the technology that we do here because of their oppressive totalitarian socialist regime, which I'll touch on a little bit later. So say they cross the water and they come to the United States and they don't have any technical skills with computers. They don't know how to fix computers or develop technology, so on and so forth. That has nothing to do with anyone in the United States. Or does that have to do with racism and discrimination? That has to deal with the adverse effects of a wretched and evil political ideology which kept certain people from learning useful, marketable, valuable skills needed in a modern economy. You also have cultural differences. In South America, you had Japanese and Germans moving to Brazil, and they were, of course, minority populations, yet they were far more productive than the incumbents, and they developed and cultivated a lot of different products, and that had nothing to do with racism or discrimination, so on and so forth. It had to do with their work ethic. Also, the Chinese and the Malaysians in Malaysia. I was reading Lee Kuan Yew's book. He was a leader of Singapore. He took them from poverty to prosperity by attracting foreign businesses and breaking down the unions and advocating for free markets and liberty and other things, wise things that he did for his society to make them prosperous. But in Malaysia, you had the leaders talking about, the Chinese, when they go to college, they're majoring in engineering and science and mathematics. And when the Malaysians go, they're majoring in cultural studies and religious studies. And that's not due to racism at all, because the Malaysians are the majority and the Chinese are the minority. So what it has to do with is cultural differences and what people value. I mean, I touched on this in a previous podcast, but when you compare the Asian illegitimacy rate in the United States to the black illegitimacy rate, there are wide disparities between the two. The Asian illegitimacy rate's about 15%, the black illegitimacy rate's about 77%. They're both minority groups, and those disparities cannot be attributed to racism or discrimination, because, like I've touched on in a previous podcast, the black illegitimacy rates were much lower in times of much more rampant discrimination against blacks. So also with purveyors of social justice, they believe that statistical disparities are anomalies and not the norm, yet they cannot provide any evidence where equal statistical distribution is the norm. I mean, let's go through some numbers here. Just some statistical disparities. Blacks make up 12% of the U.S. population, yet 75% of all NBA players are black. Blacks make up 12% of the U.S. population, but from 1975 to today, they have committed over half the murders in the United States. Single mothers make up 19% of all families in the United States, but make up 51% of all families in poverty. In 1960s Malaysia, the Chinese minority received 408 engineering degrees, while the Malay majority received 4. 94% of all American prisoners are male. 25% of all U.S. homicides occur in 4 cities: Detroit, Baltimore, Washington, D.C., and Chicago. More than 75% of American K-12 teachers are women. In 1908, Germans were the sole producers of the following products in St. Paul, Brazil: metal furniture, trunks, stoves, paper, hats, neckties, leather, soap, glass, matches, beer, confections, and carriages. Japanese settlers in the same area produced more than 2/3 of the potatoes and more than 90% of the tomatoes. I could sit here for days and talk about statistical disparities. We can talk about, over 90% of all nurses are female. 95% of construction workers are male. What, over 90% of all workplace fatalities are male. And we cannot attribute all these statistical disparities to discrimination. What is much more rational to think, and this is displayed in the evidence, is that these disparities are due to differences in behavior, in differences in culture. I mean, why don't, and it's not only culture, but it can be genetics as well. You know, why do you see so many blacks in basketball, but you don't see many Japanese? You know, why is baseball a big sport in Japan, but basketball isn't? Why is soccer the most popular sport in the world, but here in the United States, it's mostly an afterthought? What I'm trying to say is that discrimination is not the sole causes of disparities. And if someone wants to make the claim that a disparity is due to discrimination, it should not be believed just because there's a statistical disparity. That person should have to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that those statistical disparities are due to discrimination. And what the purveyors of social justice do is they point to those statistical disparities and they say that they're discrimination, and they come up with ways to take away the individual freedom of people and impose their view of the world on others. So they'll see, 70% of workers in tech are male, so that must mean sexism. So we must take away 20% of perfectly qualified men who go into tech and bring in 20% of women who might not be qualified in the name of social justice. And that's a huge problem. It's a very big problem, because that is discrimination. That is bigotry against men, because you're saying because of your gender, you can't do this. And it's discriminatory towards women, because it's saying, even though you might not be as qualified as these men to do this job, we're going to put you here, not because you deserve it, not because you've earned it, but because of your gender. It's despicable. And also, in this idea of social justice, they turn achievement into privilege. For example, if I recall correctly, in the elite schools, public high schools in New York City, even though there are far less Asians in New York City than whites, the Asians outnumber the whites 2-1. But what people will do in this country, and what they've done historically all across the world, is instead of looking at minority groups or even majority groups that have succeeded, instead of saying, these people have succeeded because they've worked hard, they were diligent, and they're producing value, they say no, they're achieving these things because of their skin color, or because of their gender, so on and so forth. And when you do that, it makes it more plausible and much more understandable to take away from these people, because you're saying that when it's an achievement. For example, when 75% of NBA players are black, no one's saying that blacks are privileged because they're much more likely to be in the NBA. So we need to lower the number of blacks in the NBA from 75% to 12% to match the population. And we need to increase the percentage of whites in the NBA from whatever number it is to the percentage of whites in the population as a whole. No one says that. And why don't they say that? Because the skin color of the NBA players, the skin color of the predominant amount of NBA players does not fit the totalitarian vision of the purveyors of social justice. The blacks are seen as some oppressed, disadvantaged group. So when they're overrepresented in something, it's not that much of a problem. But if it was the opposite, if 3/4 of the NBA was Chinese, you'd be hearing a lot more. You'd be hearing a lot more hubbub and dissatisfaction with it. And instead of saying, If that was the case, they wouldn't say that those Chinese are better at basketball and they've achieved it. They'll say somehow the Chinese are privileged and somehow they don't earn it or they don't deserve it. So and by making the argument that someone doesn't deserve something, it becomes much easier psychologically to justify forcibly taking away what they have done and what they have done for themselves. It really is the act of turning the active into the passive. And that truly is evil. It truly is evil to get government or some other force and forcibly take the rightful property of someone else and give it to someone who it doesn't belong. That is very immoral. What is moral is allowing free people in a free society to make the decisions that they like to make and to reap the rewards of the decisions that they've made. If you want to achieve like the Chinese, this is something I think to myself all the time. If you want to achieve like the Chinese, then study like the Chinese. Work like the Chinese. Taking away from the Chinese, it might benefit you in the short run. It might benefit the political demagogues that advocate for such immorality in racism and discrimination. But in the long run, by not acquiring the human capital that the Chinese have to be prosperous and successful, you're going to end up right back at square one. And that's the big problem with turning achievements into privileges. So let's talk about social justice in practice. Let's talk about how this ideology is applied in the real world. Let's take Mao, for example. Mao, millions and millions of people were killed under his rule in communist China, under famines, put in slave work camps, so on and so forth, because he had this vision of the world that people who advocate for free markets and capitalists, these capitalist roaders, they steal from people and they're evil. So what we should do is we should force everyone to work under the government, and everyone will be the same and will be prosperous, and there'll be no strife and anything of the sort. China's economy only took off once he was replaced and they started freeing up the markets and attracting foreign investments, so on and so forth. The people of China did not prosper under this social justice ideology. They were poor. They were hungry. They weren't free. It was truly evil. Let's talk about Stalin and the kulaks as well. Stalin, the same kind of thing. The free market is evil. Profits are evil. So the government's going to take control of everything. We're going to tell everyone what to do. This concentrated elite is going to tell everyone what to do. We're going to tell everyone what to produce. We're going to set the prices. And the kulaks were some very successful farmers. And they did not want to rightfully give up what belonged to them to a tyrannical government controlled by a self-anointed centralized elite. So what Stalin's government did was forcibly take away their property and give it to people who did not belong. They put those farmers in slave work camps. And one of the negative outcomes was a huge famine. And that famine was due in part to killing the productive people in the name of social justice. Those successful farmers, they're not successful because they've acquired human capital. They know how to farm and they work hard and they're diligent. No. They're only successful because they're stealing from someone else. They're exploiting someone else. They are privileged. So it gives them the moral right or whatnot to have forcibly taken something away from them. That's the danger of social justice. Castro is another example. Under Bautista, Cuba wasn't great, but their GDP was middle of the pack in Latin America. Their healthcare was pretty good, and their education was pretty good. And when Castro took over, he put a lot of people in jail. Their GDP went from being middle of the pack in Latin America to the bottom. You know, freedom of association was restricted. Free trade was restricted. You know, all these totalitarian ideas were implemented, and the Cuban people were much worse off under Castro than they were under Batista. But why did Castro chase off the investors that are bringing wealth to the country? Because he believed in social justice. He believed in dependency theory, that people bringing capital to your country and investing in your country and creating jobs and wealth was somehow exploitative. It somehow hurt the country to have foreign investments in your country. Yet no one can make the argument that countries are better off before the foreign investors were there. And by closing off his country to the accomplishments and to the capital of the rest of the world, he doomed those people to a life of poverty and moral and intellectual squalor. Another one, let's take Hitler and Mussolini. Their fascist and socialist platform advocated for the government control of wages and hours of work, higher taxes on the wealthy, government set limits on profits, government care for the elderly, a decreased emphasis on religion and the role of family in personal and social decisions, and government taking on the role of changing the nature of people, usually beginning in early childhood. Whose political platform does that sound like? Who is that closer to? Is that closer to the Republican Party, or is that closest to the Democrat Party? That is much, much closer to the Democrat Party. You know, Hitler killed so many Jews. He was angry with the Jews because they were prosperous, they were successful, and the Jews have had a history of being chased out of countries because people did not understand their role in the economy, and no one has ever explained how these economies were better before the Jews were there and how their economies improved after the Jews left. And why were Hitler and Mussolini advocating for these kind of policies? They were doing it in the name of social justice. They did not want equality of opportunity. They wanted equality of outcome. So what they're saying was, it doesn't matter what your input is. Every output should be the same. And if outputs are not the same, it is up to a concentrated elite to force people to do things that they would not do to fit someone's utopian vision of the world. And this has led to bloodshed and the death of millions everywhere that has been implemented. Let's keep going with some of these examples. We can talk about affirmative action and racial quotas and how much hostility that has created in our country. When Asians are penalized a couple hundred points on the SAT because of their race, and blacks are given points on their SAT scores because they're black, that is racist in a numerous amount of ways. It's racist that you're prioritizing one person's skin color over another person's skin color. And it's also racist because you're holding blacks to lower academic standards than anyone else. Like, that to me is offensive. What we should be doing is holding everyone to the same academic standards, and those that meet the required academic standards should be let into the university, and those who don't should not, regardless of gender and regardless of skin color. I was reading this in a Thomas Sowell book, and I've also watched an interview that he did about this, where he talked about the mismatch theory with affirmative action. In blacks, you had blacks being mismatched with schools that they weren't qualified for, so their dropout rates were higher, and to survive in certain high quality schools, they slip into some easy subject like black studies, even though they were perfectly qualified to go to a lesser institution and succeed. And you had when the affirmative action ban was implemented in the 90s in the UC system, you had the number of black students decrease slightly, but graduation rates went up. And the reason for that is that blacks were going to schools that they were academically qualified to go to. They weren't used as props for a social vision. They weren't used as props to show how diverse the campus is, and people not caring whether they drop out or not. No, they were going to schools that they're qualified to go to, and they ended up succeeding later in life because they were held to the same academic standards as other people. Another example of social justice, we can talk about restorative justice. And restorative justice is truly evil because what it does is, one, it holds people to different standards of behavior based on skin color. And it also looks at disparities in rates of offending. So they'll say blacks are 2 to 3 times more likely to be suspended than whites, but they're not attributing those differences to behavior. So what they've done is, instead of punishing students that are misbehaving, they keep them in class, they play ring around the rosy with them, they talk to them, they do anything but punish them for their bad behavior. So anyone who has a brain would say, hey, if you're not punishing kids for bad behavior, that's only going to encourage more bad behavior, and the problem's only going to get worse. And that's what's happened in the past, and that's what's happening today in schools all across the country. You have teachers complaining all across the country about students being more disrespectful, they're being more violent, and they're being more disruptive because they understand that actions don't have consequences. I used to be a teacher. I can tell you firsthand, I've seen kids run out of class to go fight. I've seen them fight in class. I've literally seen kids who are wrestling the entire time that I was in the class, and you could do nothing about it because of their skin color. And even when you send them out, they're just back an hour later. So they understand, hey, the cost of misbehavior is very low. So I'm going to misbehave more because it doesn't cost as much. That's basic price theory. When you lower the price of something, you'll get more consumption. When you raise the price of something, you'll get less consumption. And the great irony of this is that these people who think that they're doing a good thing by keeping violent, disruptive kids in the classroom, one, they're wasting taxpayer dollars because these violent kids are disrupting the learning process for everyone else. So that's one. They're making teaching and the allocation of these resources much less efficient. Also, by not punishing these kids for their bad behavior and showing them that actions have consequences, they're going to have no incentive to stop this chaotic, deviant behavior. So that's going to make them more likely to go to prison in the long run than if you punish them early and tried to rectify the behavior early. And the Parkland shooter, for example, he was caught bringing bullets to school, but he wasn't reported to the authority because of restorative justice. They didn't want to ruin this kid's life. So instead of enforcing the law equally and punishing him under the law, they did not punish him under the law. So he was able to buy a gun that he would not have been able to buy if people actually enforce the law. If they had equal treatment under the law, those kids would not have been murdered by this psychopathic miscreant if he had been punished. And I've seen it personally. It's happening in schools all across the country. And people think that they're doing a good thing, but they're not. They're making the problem much worse. And that's really a story of government intervention overall. You know, there's a problem, the government intervenes, and more often than not, the problem that they set out to resolve becomes much worse. Okay? Also, more examples of social justice. You have hostility between groups. For example, Pol Pot in Cambodia. He was a communist, a purveyor of social justice. He forced all the educated people the productive people out of the cities. He forced them under government coercion, obviously. He forced them to work in the fields because of social justice. He felt that these educated people, the reason why they were making money was because they were exploiting people and they were taking advantage of the poor. So in the name of the poor, we're going to take away from the productive people and we're going to force them to do something that they normally wouldn't do on their own accord. And it led to what? I look at the figures. Maybe at least the estimate was about 700,000 to 5 million deaths because of this. And also their economy crumbled because they got rid of all the productive people. These purveyors of social justice do not understand economics. He did not understand the role that those people played in a successful economy. So what he did was he made their lives worse and he made the lives of everyone worse because he wanted equality of outcome. But as I've mentioned previously, equality of outcome is not possible because of numerous factors that have nothing to do with discrimination or exploitation or some other nonsense that they bring up. Let's give some more examples. The Latvians and the Germans and the Czechs and the Germans. You had, at least with the Latvians, the pathway of success in their country was to learn German because the German culture had become literate far ahead of the Latvians, so more books were written in German. So if you wanted to go to school, you had to learn German. But these people, educated in these colleges that promote ethnic pride and racial hostility and resentment and anger, they had these people in these soft subjects who come out and tell their people, hey, you are where you are not because that you lack the skills or you haven't assimilated to the values of the dominant culture. You are where you are because those Germans are taking advantage of you. They are mean. They are evil. And it led to chaos and dysfunction. Same thing that happened with the Czechs and the Germans. Another example of this is the Spanish expulsion of the Moriscos in 1609. And their agriculture suffered. The agricultural industry suffered because the Moriscos were the most skilled at doing agriculture. Even one of the people in Spain asked, who will make our shoes now? Because that's one of the things that the Moriscos did. Or in Uganda, for example, the Gujaratis from India. These very successful, productive people. They were ran out of Uganda by the purveyors of social justice, saying that the Gujarati minority has achieved what they've achieved not because of their hard work, not because of their valuable skills, not because of their work ethic, so on and so forth, but they've achieved what they've achieved because they've stolen from you, or they're treating you badly, and they're exploiting you. So what they did was they ran them out, and of course the Ugandan economy fell apart because they drove out all their productive people, and wherever the Gujaratis went, they continued to be prosperous there, even though they had to leave all their physical capital back in Uganda. Because there's a difference between human capital and physical capital, and a lot of people don't want to admit that outputs, more often than not, are due to a difference in the quality of inputs. Okay? And this whole racial demagoguery is not just black and white in the United States. I mean, you've had, like I said, the Chinese in Southeast Asia, places like the Philippines, places like Malaysia, the Jews in Eastern Europe, Asians in East Africa, etc. When it comes to a dominant group, when it comes to them looking at a minority group that's succeeding, if they have the choice of looking at themselves in the mirror and looking at what they're not doing as to why they're not as successful as that minority group, or being resentful of that minority group because they're succeeding, most people choose to be resentful. let me close this up here. Thomas Sowell once said that it is amazing how many people seem to think that the government exists to turn their prejudices into laws. And that is what social justice is in a nutshell. It is turning people's prejudices into laws. If you think that some group has some kind of unfair privilege, let's discriminate against them, and let's prop up some other group that doesn't have the same qualifications, and let's be damned of the adverse consequences. Let's take away from productive people by force, and let's give it to unproductive people regardless of the consequences. Maybe we drive away the productive people who are providing the human capital and the goods and services, and once they're gone, we no longer have those goods and services, so we're much poorer than we were before. Another example, communism and socialism, they believe that free markets and capitalism rest on exploitation and all this other nonsense. Yet we've seen time and time again in these communist and socialist countries, the quality of life is much lower. They're much poorer. They lack basic human freedoms, and they have much less goods and services produced in these countries than freer countries. But people are drawn to these ideologies because they have feelings of anger and resentment and jealousy and envy and hatred. And as I've explained, and as history has shown us time and time again, that does not lead to prosperity. It does not lead to equality under the law. It does not lead to individual freedom and liberty. It leads to tyranny. It leads to a small, concentrated elite controlling the lives of millions of people. It leads to death, starvation, racial resentment and hostility, and anger. So my antidote would be, don't fall for the race hustlers. Don't fall for the demagoguery of the left and other purveyors of social justice. Disparities are very seldom due to discrimination. And if someone is saying that disparities are due to discrimination, they need to prove that. They can't just go around saying that because there's some disparity and it doesn't match their utopian vision in the world, you should give them more power to move around, free human beings like chess pieces on a chessboard, and not give a damn about the individual freedom of people, not give a damn about their achievements, not give a damn about their work ethic or their interests, but to only care about a vision and not the flesh and blood people and the adverse consequences that they face because of this evil, totalitarian vision. That's the Lord Gord Podcast. I hope you enjoyed it. Subscribe on iTunes. Subscribe on YouTube. Share it with your friends. Donate to me on Patreon. Get the Lord Gord album, This Isn't TV, on iTunes, Google Play, so on and so forth. If you live in LA, come to the Blues Jam at the Airliner every Tuesday night from 9 to midnight. It's 21 and over. Free admission. $1 tacos. Come and have a good time. Next week, I'm going to talk about the underclass. I'm going to talk about the worldview and the behavior that makes up different underclasses across the world. I'm going to talk about political ideologies and policies that encourage underclass behavior, the adverse consequences of underclass behavior, and what we should do going forward. I'm Lord Gord. I'll talk to you next time.